Marvel Television's Wonder Man, an 8-episode series, now streaming on Disney+.
A superhero remake, not exactly what we'd expect from an Oscar-winning director.
Action! Simon Williams, audition for Wonder Man.
I'm gonna need you to sign this, assuming you don't have superpowers.
I'll never work again if anyone found out.
My lips are sealed.
Marvel Television's Wonder Man. All 8 episodes now streaming, only on Disney+.
Adobe Acrobat Studio, your new foundation. Use PDF spaces to generate a presentation. Grab your docs, your permits, your moves. AI levels up your pitch, gets it in a groove. Choose a template with your timeless cool. Come on now, let's flex those tools. Draft, design, deliver, make it sing. AI builds the deck so you can build that thing. Do that, do that, do that with Acrobat. Learn more at adobe.com/do-that-with-Acrobat.
Hello friend. Do come in, relax, make yourself comfortable, and welcome to the History Book Club, a club that welcomes all history lovers. Drink? Now, shall we begin? Today's episode is a subject that has been quite prominent for the last few years, the Atlantic slave trade. And today's book, Survivors, is a quite brilliant one that focuses on one voyage in particular, that of the Clotilda. Joining is Hannah Durkin, who tells the harrowing tale of one boat's enslaved people, from when they are captured in West Africa, through to their journey across the Atlantic to Mobile, Alabama, and then the story of the descendants. So let's get straight to it. Hannah, it's such a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And for the listeners' benefit, we should mention that you are the Wolfson Prize winner. So as we were just saying before we started recording, this is the Oscars for history. So Hannah is has basically written the best history book of 2025.
Well, thank you. There are lots of other great books out there.
There are. Having been reading this, it is so hugely powerful reading your book that really I'm not surprised that you won it, because I think that is the sort of overriding emotion reading your book, is that parts of the story that really hit home, like the journey for the enslaved people of the Clotilda, is just quite awful. And so I suppose it's themes like that emerge from your book that really make the story live with the reader. I mean, writing it, you've got to sort of, I guess, take a clear-eyed historical approach to these sorts of things. But you've written about it in such a way that it really hits home to the reader as well. So I wondered, that was something that you were always aiming to do, writing this history.
Absolutely. I mean, what I wanted to do was try to let the survivors speak for themselves as much as possible. And when I started out writing the book, I didn't realise that it would be a book at first. I thought possibly it might be an academic article, but I kept uncovering more and more information and interviews with the survivors of the Clotilda. And so what I tried to do was just see how many, quotations, how much I could actually sort of put together that brought their voices to life, and that basically guided my entire book, because I was aware that there are very few comparable accounts, or certainly an account of an entire slave ship voyage from the perspective of survivors. That's, you can't find that anywhere really. So I tried to do justice to their stories, basically. No, you can't. But and what's great is you also, blend in the narrative of the history of Atlantic slavery as well. Perhaps we should sort of step back for the listeners' benefit and just explain what the Clotilda is, what Survivors is, what the story is behind Survivors. Yeah, absolutely. So Survivors is about the survivors of the last US slave ship, which docks in the port city of Mobile, Alabama, in July 1860, almost exactly 9 months before the start of the US Civil War. And there were 110 captives on board. Very sadly, they didn't all survive the voyage, this 45-day voyage across the Atlantic from what is present-day Benin to Mobile, Alabama. And they were a mixture. Half of them were girls, half of them were boys. And I say that they were really girls and boys rather than men and women because so many of them were so young. The youngest was just 2 years old, 2-year-old girl with her mother on board with her mother and her sisters. And she actually lived until 1940. So she's, as far as I can tell, the last survivor of the Clotilda. And I know her grandson quite well. Hopefully seeing him again in February. But he is well into his 80s now. But he is, he's only 2 generations removed from this history.
So he wouldn't remember his grandmother then?
No, so he was born in about 1937, I think, and she died in January 1940, or maybe 36. But his earliest memory is of almost falling into her grave at the funeral. And what's quite sad, actually, is the fact that he did not know until I wrote to him. He knew his grandmother was an African woman, but he didn't know that she was on this particular slave ship. So he didn't know her history until I reached out to him. So that shows how far this history of this slave ship voyage has been lost, or had been lost, really.
Yes. Well, one of the things, because this voyage takes place in 1860, there's a temptation to think, this is kind of one that slipped through. And because, as many will be aware, the slave trade, even in America, has been supposedly banned by 1860. And but that's not the case at all, is it, really? Because the southern states are still so reliant on slave labor. Even, of course, that's the reason for the Civil War. Yeah.
So Great Britain and America banned the slave trade around the same time, so 1807, 1808. And the United States declares it piracy in 1820, which means that it's a capital crime. So if you're caught, you can be executed for it. But this doesn't stop the trade. It carries on. In fact, about more than a quarter of all African people trafficked across the Atlantic are trafficked after 1808. So there's this huge 19th century trade that's mostly centered, mainly on Brazil and then Cuba, so not the United States itself. But it's certainly true that slave ships are traveling to the United States up until just before the Civil War. The Clotilda isn't the only one. And that's in large part because, the British Navy takes the lead in policing the trade. But a lot of the ships that are sailing across the Atlantic are built in the United States and flying the US flag, because they know that now the US has a very powerful navy. It's been at war with Great Britain. So Britain doesn't really dare, or the British Navy ships don't really dare to stop these particular ships. And the United States itself doesn't heavily police the slave trade until the Civil War as well. So, so there's this huge illegal trade happening throughout most of the 19th century.
And in Clotilda's case, this has quite negative effects, the Royal Navy squadron, because that means that the crew are unwilling to really have the enslaved up into the deck to get some fresh air. And reading about the conditions, it would be, I think this is something that really everyone should hear about, because the conditions are horrific. They
are, and very sadly. So the captors are held below deck for the first 13 days of this 45-day voyage. According to one of the note, it's not identified. It's an anonymous note in Mobile Public Library's archives, but this anonymous note, presumably written by one of the enslavers, notes that a 16-year-old girl died 2 days into the voyage. So this is how horrific the conditions are. But you almost feel sorry for the crew, because they don't know until they get to West Africa that they're actually there on a slave ship voyage. So they're sort of tricked into this experience. Not that excuses what they do, but obviously they're incredibly afraid that they will be caught by the British Navy, or even Portuguese anti-slave patrol.
And you mentioned it being a capital crime for transporting slaves, but I think I'm right in saying, and you can correct me, but only one captain is actually executed. So does that suggest then it's not really taken particularly seriously, even if you are caught in America, in the American system?
Yes, it's not until 1862, which is interestingly during the Civil War under Lincoln's presidency, that someone is executed, a man named Nathaniel Gordon. And again, in the Mobile Public Library, there's an anonymous handwritten note that is talking about this man as if there's this real fear. Once he's been executed, suddenly there's this fear that if they are caught, even years after the crime, they could be executed too, those responsible for this crime.
So does that act as any kind of deterrent, or are the profits so significant that it continues?
Yeah, so certainly because this man isn't executed until 1862, so 2 years after the Clotilda Voyage, it's likely there is little fear of it, of capital punishment. But also, very horribly, it's much cheaper to traffic people across the Atlantic than to effectively traffic them again, I guess, from the upper southern states to the lower southern states. Because they're so expensive in the United States, it's very cheap to actually buy young people across the Atlantic.
And the experience of course, those who are enslaved on the ship itself. I mean, they're amazing. One thing I really liked was, I think you keep, in your writing of quoting them, you keep their kind of voice. I guess what I mean by that is their accent throughout, and their colloquialisms as well. It really makes the message from them even more powerful.
Yes, I mean, very sadly, a lot of them never learned to speak English, or only even half a dozen words of English. It was generally the youngest members of the community, those who might have been enslaved in the households of their captors, who were obviously dealing with their captors every day. But yeah, it was a challenge to know how to quote them precisely, because different sources cite that, their words slightly differently. But also, I didn't want to reinterpret their words, because I'm then just messing with their voices. So I just cited them as they appeared in the various texts. Yes,
and it helps sort of build up more of a character, so you can kind of get to know them. I mean, Casula, I was just looking at the picture of Casula, because you've got some images of these survivors in the book as well.
Yes, I mean, sadly aren't photographs of everybody, to my knowledge. But one thing that was so wonderful so the descendant community, those who were aware of their ancestry, have worked really hard. Certainly key figures in Mobile have worked really hard to keep alive, and outside Mobile as well, but to keep alive their ancestors' stories. And they were very generous in terms of what they shared with me. And so I really benefited from, a couple of pamphlets that were published back in the mid-80s that included things like receipts of, very sadly, like the receipt for essentially for a grave marker, for a gravestone for the daughter of a Clotilda survivor. Really poignant, really moving historical documents. Oral interviews taken decades ago. That really helped, again, to recover who these people were and tell their stories.
Very striking, because you get the sort of the full story. So by that I mean, when these people are captured, there's a kind of feudal system going in what is now modern day Nigeria, and rival clans sort of picking on each other. And this is an element of that I actually didn't know that much about. And I guess it hits home as to, how easily you could be sort of swept up and then be part of the enslaved people.
Yeah, what's really sad is that the attack, so this community, so almost all of them appear to have come from the same town in present-day southwest Nigeria. And the town is attacked in the early hours of the morning. So it's this total brutal assault, and it lasts about half an hour. And so many of the more mature members of the community are cut down and killed. And then they're forcibly marched 250 miles to the coast. It's a horrendous experience. The survivors are forced to look upon the severed heads of their dead family members and community members. But what's happening in certainly West Africa this time? I mean, the Clotilda survivors are members of what used to be the Oyo Empire, which is this empire that really becomes very powerful in the centuries prior to the Clotilda Voyage. But it's this really powerful empire, essentially a slave trading empire. Its wealth, its power comes from the slave trade. But by the time the Clotilda Voyage happens, it's disintegrated really, and the empire that superseded it is in present-day Benin, just west of Nigeria. That's the Dahomey Empire. And of course, these empires are at war with one another because, so much of it, it doesn't necessarily excuse it, but of course, it's a very dog-eat-dog environment where if you're not enslaving, capturing people and selling them, then your society is the one that's going to be attacked and enslaved.
Because, of course, the slave trade itself has been banned, but slavery is not banned, of course, in the southern states. So does that basically mean then for those sort of investors in this ship that once it arrives safely in Alabama, then they are free to trade their produce, as I guess they would call it, their cargo. They're as free to just get on with it and do it.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's not very well policed at all. I mean, this is the eve of the Civil War, so a few of the Clotilda captors are indicted, but they're never brought to trial because the Civil War happens. But also, it's Southern judges. But the Clotilda is scuttled and burned as soon as it arrives, but it's still visible at low tide in the the Mobile River. Decades later, there's a photograph of it, and there's archaeologist is convinced that it's a photograph of the Clotilda, and that's taken in about 1912. But certainly it's what's quite horrible is that a journalist from the London Times travels on a steamboat owned by the lead Clotilda captor in 1861, so around about the time the Civil War begins. And he's on this steamboat, and there are all these young African children on board, working on board, labouring on board. And the Clotilda captor is so clearly so unafraid of being arrested that he parades one of those children. He jokes about him being from South Carolina and that that he's got facial markings because his mother wants to make sure she can identify him. It's quite horrible. But there is this openness. Some of the captors are working on steamboats, which are the main mode of transportation up and down Alabama. So it's a crime in open sight, basically.
Right. Yes. What is the experience of the captives once they're in Alabama? Because obviously the first 4 years there's war ongoing. So how does the Civil War affect their early years when they're in Alabama?
So they're captives. So some of the captives are held in Mobile, in the port city of Mobile. They're forced to work. So some of them are working on the steamboats up and down the Alabama River. Some of the girls are working in the households of their enslavers. Other captives are scattered around central Alabama. A lot of them are working on the cotton fields. And in one sense, the Civil War doesn't affect their experience very much because they're held in bondage for 5 years. So they're not freed until 1865. But they are those who are in Mobile, there's sort of a vague awareness that something is happening and a hope that they will be freed, but obviously they wait in vain for several years. Those who are sent to central Alabama, some of them end up in Montgomery, which is the capital of the Confederacy. So they're actually witnessing and probably very visible to the leadership of the secession movement. So the first capital of the Confederacy. So in that sense, must be very aware of what's going on, very aware of something major happening, but also the fact that they are so, such a visible presence to the leadership of the secession movement. This fight over slavery is not in any way affected by these poor African children who've just been trafficked across the Atlantic.
And you mentioned the cotton trade, which, I mean, I knew was, of course, a major part of the economy, but I suppose I wasn't aware just quite how significant it is. I mean, the numbers are mind-boggling. Do you mind just explaining how significant the cotton trade was to the South?
Yeah, so essentially...
And indeed the global economy, really.
Yeah, I mean, so much of the British economy and so much of the cotton, it's something like 90%, I might be getting my figures wrong, but, is going across to Liverpool. It's a huge, huge amount. So in that sense, it's greatly affecting our society as well. So it's essentially a monocrop. I mean, they're sent to central Alabama, which is known as the Black Belt. And that's a reference to this hugely fertile, dark-coloured soil, which is where the cotton grows best. So this is really, pretty much the part of the country where the cotton grows best. So they are, literally in the heart of this cotton industry, absolutely the heart. And of course, they are the ones labouring until after nightfall, for long, long hours in these absolutely horrendous conditions to produce it. And of course, from a very young age as well.
Members of the History Book Club, please forgive my interruption, but I have an important request. A friend of mine, Ian Wilson Young, Yes, indeed, all surnames are double-barrelled here at the History Book Club. Anyway, Ian is on a mission to Ukraine, whereby he purchases a pickup truck and fills it with medical supplies before heading out close to the front lines to provide support for those fighting the Russian hordes. This is an appeal for you to donate, even if it's a very small amount. I put a link in the show notes to the Just Giving page. Now, let's return to the club.
Even after the end of the Civil War, there'll be a temptation to think, oh, it's, wonderful, happy days, everyone's free and life can get better. But that's certainly not the case, is it?
No, I mean, in many ways, the situation for certainly those in the Black Belt and this Cotton Belt, it doesn't materially change. I mean, they become sharecroppers, which means they're working for a share of the crop and not for a wage. So they're still as trapped as ever. There's no way that they can escape that environment. Very sadly, some of them die in the cabins in which they were enslaved. It's really it's absolutely terrible. Of course, they want desperately to go home.
That's a yearning throughout their lives almost, isn't it? Just to return from a place where they, I guess, hadn't really spent that much of their lives in.
Yeah, that absolutely. It's so central to their identity there. I mean, they have such this idyllic childhood that's hopefully comes through strongly early on in my book. What's striking is that some of them strategize to go home. They agree to meet annually in Montgomery to strategize how to go home. Of course, they never manage it. Those who are left behind or who stay in Mobile, they are able to labour for a wage. I mean, first of all, they beg their captors to pay for their passage because, of course, it's the least they owe them after what they put them through. But of course, they're immediately turned down, and they end up buying land, but they actually have to buy the land from their former captors as well, which is really quite horrible. But what is striking is the fact that although they cannot go home, they create these amazing communities. And in Alabama, I mean, the one that's best documented is Africa Town, or what they called African Town, what is now known as Africa Town in Mobile, north of Mobile. And this is a community that's established by the Clotilda survivors themselves, according to their West African cultural practices, really. I mean, they establish, what's striking is they build their own homes, they build a church and a school, they appoint a leader, 2 judges and a doctor. This is a really highly ordered society. And it grows into this community of about 2,000 to 3,000 people by the turn of the 20th century. And what's striking as well is the fact that this is a really economically successful community, unusually for the time. That this is a Black community where people own their own businesses. And what's especially striking is that the leaders of the community are still the Africa Town survivors, the Clotilda survivors. And they're also the most successful and hardest working members of the community, even into their 70s and 80s. They're really quite incredible people there. Just determination to provide for each other and to provide for their descendants is incredible.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, why do you think that is?
I think they're just such incredible people. Their drive to endure and survive is quite incredible. But they care for each other so much. Their bonds are so strong. I mean, it's also striking that because a lot of them appear to be related, in many cases, siblings or cousins. And what really struck me as well was the fact that I came across, because I managed to identify quite a few survivors by comparing them across census data. And I happened to notice that 2 survivors who had been living in central Alabama had somehow found their way 150 miles downriver to Africa Town more than 20 years after they were separated from their fellow Clotilda survivors. So not until the 1880s. And I worked out as well that because one of those 2 survivors died, sadly, just before the 20th century, but his son was being raised by an Africa Town founder, Clotilda survivor, and the census made it clear that the child she was raising was her nephew. So this brother and sister reunited after more than 20 years.
Yes, it's something sort of positive, I guess, amidst all the horror. The other element to your book, which is really interesting, is of course Selma comes up, and I guess most people will be aware of, how significant that was in the civil rights movement. But what influence did Clotilda have, or the Clotilda survivors have, in the civil rights movement in the 60s?
Yeah, so it was quite striking. I think I made this connection because I'd seen the film Selma. I'd seen it a couple of times. I remember seeing it in the cinema, but there's an interview with Matilda McCrear, who was the last Clotilda survivor, as far as we can tell, the 2-year-old girl, and she made the local news because she had basically marched for compensation from her home about 15 miles outside Selma to Dallas County Courthouse in Selma. So she'd gone to the judge there to ask for compensation for what she'd been through, what she was, of course, still going through. And this is December 1931, so this is the height of the Great Depression. So obviously, a horribly desperate time for her. And this is a time when she's in her 70s now and she's still working in the cotton fields with her son, basically, her youngest child. But Dallas County Courthouse is a significant location in the civil rights movement because it's where activists gathered to demand their voting rights, which, basically marks the start of the Selma Voting Rights Campaign, which ultimately leads to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which is the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which is a key piece of civil rights legislation. So it's really interesting that she has that connection with that space. But what's also interesting is that her grandson, who I know, Johnny Creer, he was actually arrested during the civil rights movement. He lives in Selma still, and he was arrested in September 1963 for refusing to allow this white man to basically shove a garter snake in his face. So he's a civil right, he's a civil rights activist. In fact, I managed to identify him as a descendant of Matilda because he'd been interviewed about his civil rights experiences for some US newspapers. So there are some interesting connections there. And also some of Matilda McCrear's great-granddaughters, they've been writing their own book because they were also civil rights activists. They, as children, were part of what was known as the Children's Crusade, which was basically this march by about 1,000 children from Birmingham Baptist Church to the heart of the Birmingham's business district. And these poor children were basically set upon by the state troopers. They were beaten, they were arrested. These great-granddaughters' own experiences were really quite horrendous. But ultimately, they managed to desegregate the city, basically. So all these kind of interesting civil rights connections. But there are broader civil rights connections, or other civil rights connections as well. So Booja Moore, who was sent to Montgomery, she lived until 1930. But horribly in her case, she was a young mother when she was kidnapped, and her 3 small children, were left behind when she was sent across the Atlantic, and she never saw them again, of course. But she travels twice a week into Montgomery, into the heart of Montgomery, to sell her foraged wares. So she does that twice a week, as she would have done traditionally as a Yoruba woman, as a woman from Oyo in West Africa. And she does that up until 1925, so not long before her death. But she's traveling along what was Market Street and is now Dexter Avenue in Montgomery. And that's the street where Rosa Parks, 70 years ago this month, refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man, triggering the Montgomery bus boycott, which is the first key battle in the civil rights movement. And Booja Moore will almost certainly have known E.D. Nixon as well, who was the first leader of the bus boycott. And one more significant connection is Radoshi, who was the penultimate survivor of the Clotilda. And she knew, at the end of her life, she knew a woman named Amelia Boynton Robinson. Boynton Robinson talked about how her encounters with Radoshi were among her richest experiences in the 1930s. And Boynton Robinson was a hugely significant figure in the civil rights movement. She lived to be 110, but she invited Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Selma, which leads to the Selma to marches and against the Voting Rights Act. So some really, really powerful civil rights connections.
Yeah, absolutely. Inevitably, though, it is so horrific, but also one wonders, we're 50, 60 years on from the civil rights movement. How do you think, because, the slavery and the American Civil War and then the experience of black people in the South particularly since, and where we are today, which is a very divided society. I was really keen to get your sort of take on what you think, how you think we kind of, I guess I'd be more interested in how there's a way forward for this sort of divided country that America is now. Is there a story in here that can guide the way for people in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that has been very powerful, and this happened when I was, or just after I actually published my first article on the Clotilda survivors, really, or certainly the identifying a Clotilda survivor. Now, a month after I published my research on Radoshi, the Clotilda was officially identified in the Mobile River. So the wreck of the Clotilda was identified in the Mobile River, and that led to difficult conversations about what should happen to the wreck of this slave ship. But also, it has generated more interest, more recognition of the community. I mean, for a long time, the Clotilda voyage was dismissed as a hoax, largely because nobody was ever brought to trial for this crime. And now there's
sorry to interrupt you, but that's quite interesting, because that suggests that people who are dismissing it as a hoax know it's a bad thing, and do you know what I mean? And so therefore, by dismissing it, they're in some way acknowledging the fact that this is a terrible crime.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, partly it's simply because I think certain historians have not included it in their book because there hasn't been the same level of evidence. But it was really the work of, two historians about 20 years ago. The first two sort of academic works on the Clotilda survivors came out about 20 years ago on Africa Town. So that helped to legitimize the story within that, the history. But the fact that the wreck has been formally identified means that there has been more tourist interest, and there is now this multi-million-dollar heritage house. It's still not, I mean, if you go to Africa Town today, there's still not a lot of the archaeological evidence isn't very strong. So even very sadly, a lot of the grave markers don't name the Clotilda survivors themselves. It's much easier to find a child of Clotilda survivor in the graveyard than the Clotilda survivor themselves. And also, what's also quite awful when you go to certain parts of the community is that the level of industrial pollution there. That's very, just horrible to see, because there are high levels of cancer in the community. So you get a sense of how the community has been neglected and exploited, and this has happened because it's a poor black community. But the fact that there is much more formal recognition of the story now means that it's harder to ignore, and there's a lot to learn from here, and it means that school children, get to visit the heritage house and get a sense of this history. So it's a national tourist site. It's won awards. The heritage house has won, I'm sure, a national award, for what it does. So if we're trying to find a positive aspect, there is that, and also just the work that descendants do, completely for free to keep alive this story. So they hold, as many events as they can throughout the year. Really, I've been invited back to an event in Africa Town in February. So I do what I can to try, celebrate the story and celebrate the lives of the Clotilda survivors.
Well, I was very interested to hear from you what your kind of reception is, because, you have an academic in England studying this. Then what did they think when you first appeared in Mobile?
Yeah,
Montgomery.
It's fantastic. Yeah. The fact that COVID made things more difficult to see people in person. But no, it was absolutely fantastic. I couldn't have felt more welcomed and more, just that sense of the amount of research that went into my book as well. They could see that I'd tried my very best to tell the stories as well as I could. And it's been quite moving as well that Pat Frazier, who's the great-great-granddaughter of Kanko, one of the last Clotilda survivors in Africa Town, she'd always believed that her ancestor was from a different place from Kazula, from other Clotilda survivors. But my research suggests that maybe that they were quite possibly cousins. she's been so thrilled to know that actually perhaps he wasn't totally alone. That she was there with members of her family, that she wasn't totally separate. She was separated from her parents, but maybe not from her siblings and cousins, and that means a lot to her.
It is such a powerful story. So, Hannah, it's been just quite wonderful to have you on. Thank you. And I mean, I have to say that I think the most moving, horrific moment in the book is early on on the voyage itself. And I think there's a very young girl who's ill, and the crew members have to come in. And I think, they're actually, in the entire ship, there weren't as many. Basically, this poor child is thrown overboard. It's quite awful. But it seemed, and I wanted to ask you this, so it's a rather depressing note to end it on, but it seemed as though there weren't that many thrown overboard as you would normally get on a voyage, or is that sort of, there's no way we can really tell?
Well, so a journalist named Nick Tabor tried to do the calculations based on the size of the ship, and he published his book Africa Town, about the community, about a year before my book came out. And I think he tried to do a calculation. He estimated that, I mean, it's horrible to talk about these things, but an average of about 8 people should statistically have died on the voyage, and about that number actually did die. So it sounds like it was a fairly standard, if that makes sense, a very horrible way to look at that experience, but it sounds like it might have been a fairly typical journey in some sense.
Well, is your copy doing well over there at the moment? I hope you've got a US publisher. Yeah,
so it's with HarperCollins in the US as well. So yes, and the paperback comes out in January in the US. So I'll have to try and sign a few in a few bookstores while I'm over there. So
yes, you should definitely do that. Well, fantastic. Well, there are links in the show notes for people who want to get the book, and they should, because it's fantastic, really important book. There aren't that many important books get published. This is certainly one. So Hannah, thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you.
We've come to the end of this club meeting, so thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch about club benefits, please do, either by email or on X or Instagram. Links are in the show notes. I've also included my Substack link so members can read articles I've written on various matters that may be of interest. The History Book Club is written and presented by me, Oliver Webb-Carter. Music is by listener Chat DMZ. Episodes continue next week and every week, so please do join, subscribe, and if you can provide the club with a 5-star rating, we would be delighted. In the meantime, I thank you again, and now I have to usher members out into the real world. Until next time. I was